I was playing Legendary Tales on my PS5 using my VR2 headset, and my 3-month-old kitten was chewing on the cord, and this is what happened. This is the beginning of a lot of learning that happened. The first step was to cut into the cable and see what we were working with. Surprise! This was my first view unwrapping the foil shielding and the aluminum ground. Look at all of those wires. This is kind of what it looked like before I unwrapped the shielding. At this point, I prematurely surmised that this would be no big deal, just a bunch of copper wires I need to solder back together. With all of these wires spread out, I noticed that each one looked like a well-made, high-end wire. And a close-up of the same image. I'm not going to give the wire count yet because there's more than what meets the eye. You see that little wire on the left that looks like a solid aluminum wire, but then at the end you see there's more little wires, a white one, green, and a ground? Yeah, that aluminum looking wire is a little smaller than those other wires. So that's even more wires than what we thought. This is a close-up of those 3 tiny wires. Each one of these wires, it was discovered, is a coaxial type wire with a center solid copper and a plastic nylon type shielding with a ground and shielding over top of that. So in this short video, I'm scraping some of the shielding off and showing what it takes to strip one of these. Of course, I'm stripping these with the only tools that I know how to use because I'm not an electronics expert by any means. I really don't know a whole lot of what I'm doing. I just know the basics of what I learned throughout life. Thankfully, I got some of these micro strippers to strip this tiny wire. The micro strippers were originally bought to do micro LEDs for some of my personal projects. This copper wire that's wrapped around the black cord holding it as I work with it, I annealed a 14 gauge copper wire, and this is what I have wrapped around the black cord because every time I get finished with one, I fold it back and put it underneath that copper wire to hold it out of the way. Trust me, there's so many wires. If I didn't do this, I would be fumbling and confused way more than what I appear to be in this video. I made sure that I didn't wrap the copper wire too tight around those tiny fragile wires. The simple tools that I used are a pair of magnification glasses. You may not need them, but I certainly do. Little clip-ons to help it even more, razor blade. There's my annealed copper wire nippers, and later you'll see these alligator clips, and I talk a little bit more about that. This is my first soldering attempt, successful soldering attempt. I used a needle to pick up the flux and wipe it on the wire, and then a really nice quality wood burner to solder the wires together. I don't have proper shielding to put on this, but there is shrink tubing, which I think is a must. I put the shrink tubing on prior to soldering the wires together, and then simply use the soldering iron to shrink the tubing. It's much quicker than using a heat gun or a torch, and a heat gun or a torch would most likely damage some aspect of these really fragile wires. Some of these wires are so thin you can barely see them, and you can pinch them and pull them apart really easily because they're so tiny. And I also learned not too long ago that, and this may be wrong, you can never really use too much flux in electronics because flux is key to a really wonderful bond. However, too much flux in plumbing is possible because it corrodes the pipes, especially on the inside. Now you notice the ground is soldered together. I didn't wrap it back around, and I didn't put any aluminum shielding. I simply put this heavier shrink tube that you see toward the bottom, slid it over and shrunk it on. Notice the alligator clip is over top of that piece of shrink tubings. Only one of those tubings are necessary for the connection. However, I have two because the wire is so thin it slips right through the gator clips. This wire, a couple of the wires aren't that thin, so the shrink tube just helped me get a better grip. I was extremely cautious on not getting that soldering tip close to any of the wires that it didn't need to be close to. So for me, this was really tiny and challenging to put those shrink tubes over the wire without fraying the ends. So I made sure to twist the wires really delicately, but really well, so the tip wasn't frayed. So this whole process was extremely challenging, and I don't know the number now, but it's like 20 or 30 different connections I needed to do. This is a exploded view of kind of like a porcupine ball of all of the wires stripped and ready to go. This is the contraption that I used to hold both wires while I soldered them. Now, this unit I purchased at Harbor Freight. I purchased two of them so I could get two sets of arms, and one of them broke right away, and another one was too compromised to work appropriately. So I rigged a couple of them. I was able to rig a couple of them to work. But if you don't have one of these and you need to get one to do this repair, I recommend a higher quality one. Wire being staged for soldering. Very close-up view of a coax soldered and shrink wrapped. You notice the scraggliness of the ground wire. I knew it was like this, and it was extremely challenging for me to get it correct. And I knew that the sleeve was going to cover it and it wasn't going to be compromised by touching the other wire. However, I do understand this is not a beautiful connection. Another close-up of everything soldered and ready to be taped up. Notice the huge ground wire. That was the first thing I soldered, and I totally got it wrong and ended up using a torch and overheating it, and it finally did solder together, but it was a huge learning curve for me. Close-up of another coax stripped. I ended up pulling the reddish, or any color that it was, shielding off. It's like a colored shellac foil or something, I'm not quite sure. Twisting the ground and then stripping and twisting the coax in the middle. This is an array of every single wire. This entire bunch is in the one wire. This is how many connections I had to make. The two red ones just in the middle of those three cotton strings, I believe those are obviously power cords. They were coiled up the center of the structure. Here is 8 different colored coax cables and one neatly shielded trio. Here are what I believe to be 2 power cables, the 3 material strings for strength, I believe, and then 4 single wire connections. I think it's stranded. Here are what I believe to be all of the different grounds. Of course, remember the ground in that neatly shielded trio. That's not in this bunch. So here alone we have 6 grounds. And I simply attached them all together and soldered them. It works.